And we are back
with another episode of the Everyday Warrior podcast.
It's been a while. I've
Were
been
we
gone
ever
for a few
away?
weeks. I was.
Yeah.
I think I was gone too.
That's right. Oh, I know you guys have been staying in. I appreciate it. It's been a few great weeks. Just got back from Italy
Nice.
with the wife.
Where'd you guys go?
We went to Sorrento, the Amalfi Coast.
Where? Give me north, south,
So
east, west.
flew into Naples.
Okay.
Which we actually flew from Austin direct to Frankfurt. Not a great airline. I'm not going to name the airline. Lufthansa.
Oh,
Lufthansa did not have a great experience.
Oh.
And especially having flown across all continents, it was a worse flight than any other flight we had.
Really? What was so bad about it?
They messed up our tickets. Like we had booked these things probably 3 months out. They switched our seats multiple times. I basically had a Karen moment.
Oh.
And
Karen Kelly or
Karen
racial slur?
Yeah. No, as in
what's the male Karen?
Chad.
Chad.
Is that what it's Chad?
Yeah, Chad.
Chad.
Okay. Well, I had a Chad moment.
I always thought your real Chad was like a good looking dude.
No, Chad's like dressed ridiculously, like really like skin tight pants and loafers.
Oh, and like hats
and
like fedoras.
All right. So we're
first of all, the fact that you showed that to your wife, you're not supposed to like show those text messages to your significant other. I didn't know if that was like rule number 1 to be married. Like I tell my wife, and it's not that she listens to this podcast. I'm like, everybody's the most amazing people. Everybody's like it doesn't do.
There is a good rule of thumb. So she laughed. She laughed. Of course, she loves you guys. That is a good rule of thumb.
Yeah.
Is man or woman, you don't come home and bitch about your workplace to your significant other because they naturally become a toxic well with you and side with you, and they're unless your husband or spouse is just extremely objective and they take it from that approach. But that's really the case. But no, let's go into this. Michelle, even young Michelle, has said, "Hey, Mike, you need to dress a little differently."
Don't do it.
Jordan has constantly gotten upset that I'm jeans and t-shirts. But of course, when I go and do keynote speeches, I'm in a blazer or professional setting. But she said, "Hey, we're going to an Italian wedding. You can't wear a ball cap."
Is your wife Italian?
No,
but you're Italian.
Yes.
Okay. So who's getting married?
So a buddy,
okay.
So old teammate.
Okay.
Don't want to go into details because still doing his thing. Which we never thought he was going to get married. This guy looks like Superman, built. We always thought he was going to be the perma bachelor. So good to see that he finally found his mate.
Nice.
Did it right. Got married in his late 30s.
Nice.
Like I think he's 39, actually 40.
Perfect.
Financially sound, brilliant dude. But anyway, she said, "Hey, listen, let me take care of the dress." So we went and let's just say the tailor showed a lot of ankle. And she ended up getting toes or shoes that are pointed on the end, and a fedora because you can't wear a baseball cap, and it was during the day. So these guys sent some pretty, and Sean started it. Sean's going to get it.
They attacked you.
They did. I've got actually pictures of, if you want to pull up Sean's Instagram, there's one of him and Tyson in, those road biker outfits that are really skin tight.
Yeah, onesies.
But here's the thing. They don't go on a 60-mile ride. They ride 1 mile to like 6th Street, and in those outfits, they go into the bars. It's just like, I'm probably going to pay for that.
I love it, dude. Those guys have a really good sense of humor.
Yeah, I know. There's 2 of them with their bicycles. It's just embarrassing because everything is like rolling.
But are they doing it ironically?
Yes.
My guess is that they're
doing it to be funny.
Yeah,
and on top of it, both of those guys have like gnarly cauliflower ears, which is like, the official don't fuck with us.
So it started a firestorm over text. And basically I said that you guys made my wife cry and she was going to murder you all. But she wasn't. She was laughing. And I get
That's what I said.
I get it.
I said it was tears of laughter.
But I think you guys are in no position to talk about dress at all. I don't think anyone here is equipped to talk on fashion in the men's realm.
Okay.
Do you think is that fair?
I'm totally fine with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. My days of high fashion are kind of behind me.
I think men really shouldn't be concerned with fashion. That's why we have jeans and t-shirts, and that's why men have worn jeans and t-shirts their entire life.
I think it's amazing, those guys.
Look at them.
Such nerds.
Just out of their element. I love it.
Yeah, they have good sense of humor.
They do. They're great guys.
That's ironic.
Yeah, I just think they're doing it. But
they're doing it.
There's a sense of irony, but if you actually look, those are real bikes.
Yeah, but I think they have like regular shoes on.
Yeah, they got tennis shoes.
Those are just tennis shoes. So they don't have the clip-in pedals, then it has to be.
Could you imagine?
has
Because
to be a
bikers get pretty aggressive.
I do like that he's got a Lululemon little fanny pack on.
Yeah,
that's good look.
They bring the fanny pack back, but no, hey, congrats. I know you recently had one of your I don't want to say pupils, but one of your clients take
well, just one of my athletes. So this last weekend was IBJJF Worlds, and Victor Hugo, who's one of my athletes, power athlete, and Philippe Costa, they both competed. Victor ended up winning double gold. So he won the open and the absolute, got submissions in the open and the absolute final, which had only happened a few times in the history of the IBJJF. I think the last person to do it probably was like Shanji, his coach. And then Shanji, obviously our other coach. First time that a former world champion has mentored another world champion to this level. And then Victor also won the open and the weight division at the Brazilian Nationals last month. So first time in history that somebody's won double gold Brazilian Nationals and won the Worlds. So he went out there and just absolutely smashed people into a million pieces.
Conditioning wise, was he?
Yeah. There was a big match with a guy who had actually beat Victor before, who was a favorite, and Victor just absolutely just decimated the dude to the point where they had pretty much like carried the dude off, and he was laying on his back, and they were having to ice his chest, and Victor was standing right there just giving an interview. So his conditioning was through the roof, and he was just so much more physical.
How old is he?
Victor's 25.
Yeah.
So, I mean, his jiu-jitsu is his branded jiu-jitsu. He moves like a little guy. He's so fluid. And now we've just added the strength and the horsepower and the flexibility and the movement. I mean, within his hips, it's really almost unfair. And then the interesting thing was a lot of the guys, because it's drug tested, some of the guys that we'd seen at ADCC and before that were like real hulky were all of a sudden not hulky. And Victor's just out there looking like a dump truck. Like, it was so physically different to see him. And it's, I mean, and Philippe, he's a first year black belt. He's 23. He finished third in his first Worlds, and he finished second in Pans. So like, he did amazing too. And so I was just so excited for those kids. I mean, this was Philippe's really first experience lifting weights. So I mean, they've only really been training for about 8 months, and to be this dominant, it was pretty amazing.
In my experience, the Brazilian side of jiu-jitsu world just isn't overly concerned with fitness. It's like they don't tend to have workout plans. They do some calisthenics before class, and then they roll, and that's it. And I get that. For the best, the most sport specific way to train your sport is to train your sport, but you still need to be strong and agile and have good cardiovascular training.
Well, we ramped up their conditioning. I mean, I got them to the point of superhuman on the conditioning piece. They were rolling 14 times a week. Then we'd get our training session. So just managing their volume. And then when I got there, just making sure that they were ready, what they needed, and just getting them prepped. And the big thing too, as obviously, coaching and working with these athletes is like the mentor piece, explaining to them the magnitude of the moment and what they have to do to be the best. So as a NFL player, there were a few moments, and I can think back to every single one, where I stepped and I knew that this moment was like my moment to whether or not, if I did what I was supposed to, it would alter the trajectory of my life. And I had this really amazing ability to realize, like, when it was happening, that I was in the moment and I knew what I needed to do. And I think a lot of guys I've met were like, fuck, like, if only I had done this. And they can only see it after the fact. So being there with Victor and being like, dude, this is your chance to put a stamp to where you go to the Hall of Fame and you're the best to ever do this. And seeing that kid realize it, and then telling him, like, remember, you're still a small town kid from Fortaleza that's going to fucking shock the world. And him being like, this is what we trained for. These are the hours we did it. And let's go out there and fucking murder these guys. And he did. Eric Manise, who the guy he beat in the absolute final, he got him in this nasty double leg lock. I mean, to the point where he rolled over like a gator. And like, we were like, oh God, he's going to break both of his legs. And the dude just tapped instantly. So that was pretty, in 90 seconds into the final. So it was amazing to be there and to like have invested 8 months of my life in training these guys and bringing them along to where like they had never lifted weights, teaching them to lift weights. And now all of a sudden they're out there and they're the best in the world, was like, holy shit. So it was neat. And then, Shanji, who's their coach, was extremely, just very thankful. But even to the point where, like, the training didn't change, the jiu-jitsu didn't change. The only change was we brought John on, and now here they are. So that was pretty big for us, for Power Athlete.
I think for a lot of athletes, yes, the moment, and the moment is sweet, but bad times cometh and bad times goeth, good times come, good times goeth. The sign of a true champion is what they do afterwards. And if they keep on going, if that's what they desire to do. But, in by no means am I assassinating Gordon Ryan, but it seems like he went a very different path post ADCC.
Yeah, well, so you know, I mean, Gordon's probably the greatest no-gi grappler. I mean, he's done some really amazing things, but he was a naturally 175-pound dude, and you know, ended up doing what he needed to be 235 pounds, and really just pushed the envelope. And I think he's paying a little bit of the price for it.
Did you see the photos?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if I would have posted that.
Yeah, I questioned that.
That's very hard on your brand, especially for somebody who's trying to, you know, obviously has an established brand and sponsors and that, like, you know. And then the other issue, like I know they're really forthcoming and honest with what they're doing, and then being like, well, it's not illegal because they don't test. No, it is still legal. As baseball, as professional football, that's how you get run up in front of a Senate Oversight Committee, where all of a sudden, you know, you're out there, you know, obviously performance enhancing for your sport, not for health or, you know, HRT type stuff. So I just am a little confused as a former NFL player, and seeing this whole thing and remembering the baseball and the Balco and all of this stuff go, like,
but those were banned by Major League Baseball and the NFL. Is the league that he rolls in, do they actually ban it? Or I mean, are they water? Do they water?
No, so he doesn't roll with the IBJJF, which has USADA and WADA and all that.
Yeah.
So he rolls outside of it. But the problem is you're still competing in like ADCC and these other flow events, which are UFC Fight Pass, and these other organizations are, you know, drug tested in this. So there's just some interesting stuff. But
it's like bodybuilding, though. There's what's the terms?
Yeah,
basically no, or
I think they call themselves natural
versus,
which those dudes ain't natural.
No. Off cycle is what it should be called.
Yeah, like you see the natural bodybuilders are like bigger than Arnold Schwarzenegger was in the 70s and the 80s. So, but I don't know. The one thing which has been universal with a lot of this, if you go to the needle and the drugs too early, and you're using it to make up for a lack of training, just experience and just really proper training, there's like a amateur novice effect when you start lifting weights, that there's some super physiological effects and gains and strength that like you will only get as a beginner. Right. And if you do something to bypass and you don't let that happen to maturity, like you don't build the foundation. We call it the base level of strength, the foundation of strength. Like you need to do that. Like that stuff may be down the road, but you got to almost be strong enough to earn the right to do that. Does that make sense? So I think for a lot of these BJJ competitors, because they don't know shit about training, they don't know proper methods, they don't know, you know, like what we do here, Power Athlete, the deficit they're trying to make up for is to go this route.
It's all you have in your corner. It's who you have in your corner advising you. Like Victor, age of 25, albeit a different sport, you've lived within that competitive realm. Yeah. And you've got a wealth of success and a wealth of failures to share with them. And I love that. Yeah.
And then he's got incredible coaches, like with Shanji Hibero, you know, Shanji for like 15 years was like the number one dude. You know, Hodger Gracie's considered the best, but like he's lost 3 times, twice to, you know, Shanji. And then his brother Salo raised those guys. And then also Rafael Lovato, who's another incredible dude.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the amount, it's pretty interesting to sit there with like all, you know, like to see the older kind of mentor coaches that are around Victor and these young guys is like, you know, Hall of Famers. And, you know, I met Hodger Gracie and Buchecha and those guys, and they were like, oh, and then he's like, oh, this is our coach, John. He does our strength. And they were like, oh, and like, oh, he played in the NFL for 10 years. And then they like looked over and, you know, the idea of like, oh, you actually found a professional, like a person that knows how to do this stuff.
Yeah.
Wow. I wonder how long that's going to take the other people.
Right.
So we'd love to have Victor on.
Yeah.
We still, you know, Sean, Tyson, would love to have Lovato and Victor on with us to discuss those top 10 UFC fights. That would be a great episode. And we'll make sure that we advertise that long enough. I know we do have a guest waiting. So Elia Saikaly is a good friend of mine. Canadian. Don't hold it against him.
Well, my mom's Canadian.
That's I knew there was reason. But you know, we're going to go to his past, and I'm going to pull. You know, if he doesn't admit some of the things in his past, as a male model, he does do the blue steel up on the Mount Everest.
Not true.
He's got some amazing stories. He personally took me over to Nepal for my trip over there. He did do all the videographer, but you know, it was great having someone who'd been there like 20 plus times, explaining everything to me, giving me the cultural and the historic side. But this guy's a stud. And if you can you find it's in the chat room?
Oh.
Everest has been under a little scrutiny, especially this year, with what's going on from trash to fatalities and just the safety of it. What I find interesting about mountaineering is, one, you either live this life or you're a millionaire who can afford to go climb it, or you've saved up. But I think a lot of people, it is a great goal to have, and they've got the money to do it, but they don't truly understand what they're stepping into. And again, much like you advise Victor, there are levels of guides or Sherpas that you want to, associate with.
Sure.
Ones that are safe and who will make the prudent call of, hey, we may be close to the peak, but the weather's coming in. Yeah. We're not going to make it this trip.
Is there like a Sherpa that you can just like strap to his back and he just carries you the whole way?
So
that's the one I need.
Yeah, let's, we've got Elia, but this is the recent article that came out. Spike in Mount Everest deaths this year is due to climate change. Come on. And overcrowding, experts say. Elia, man, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Climate change, killing everybody.
So, so you recently, Everest was this was what number time for you climbing Everest?
Yeah, so this was my 11th expedition to Everest, and the trip actually that we were on 2 years ago, that was, I think, trip 24 to Nepal. But yeah, this would have been the 6th summit and then the 11th expedition to Everest.
And you say it would have been the 6th summit. You had to make a very tough decision to pull back. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, seemingly tough decision, you would think. But I think after, just being there that many times and just understanding the spectrum of problems and just having the experience and knowing what it is that my mission is, which is not about reaching the top of the world, it's really to support the team that I'm with. So yeah, I was actually, I was climbing with my best mate, PK Sherpa Pasankaju, who worked on your trip actually with Drop Zone Everest. And PK was guiding a good friend of mine named Yusuf Al-Shatti. He's actually a colonel in the Special Forces in Kuwait. And so I was there supporting my good friend. I was filming his expedition, and he was climbing without supplemental oxygen, which there are less than 300 people on the planet who have achieved that goal versus the thousands that have summited Everest. And in doing my research and talking to people that have summited Everest without supplemental oxygen, no O2, they all spoke about this threshold between 8,600 and 8,700 meters above sea level. So that's almost 28,000 feet. And a lot of people talked about this almost system shutdown, where the brain shuts down and they barely remember what happened between 8,600 and 8,848. And so I walked back to catch up with my team. I was flying my drone, doing all kinds of filmmaking stuff. That was the other half of my responsibility. Walked into this scenario, and Yusuf was suddenly on supplemental oxygen. So in that moment, I knew the expedition was over. We weren't going to the top, and my core mission was just to help my team get down safely.
Have you ever done no O2?
I haven't. No. I always say that having the responsibility of cameras and technology and chasing people and running backwards up the mountain, that's kind of like my version of no O2, because it's this whole set of additional responsibilities. But no, every time I'm working, which is every time I'm up on the mountain, for me, the most responsible way to do it is I need to be sharp. I need to, perform at the highest level, be responsible. So no, I've never tried without supplemental oxygen, but you cannot compare the two. It's kind of like the minor leagues and the major leagues, right? It's just, there's just no comparison whatsoever, to when you're what a lot of purists call it. They call it actually, oxygen doping, if you will, because what they say is that you essentially reduce the mountain down to your level. It's a very Eastern European mindset where, from their perspective, the most pure way by fair means that you can, sort of attack the mountain, if you will, is just, going up against the mountain, you versus the mountain versus yourself by fair means without O2.
It seems like a physiologic threshold that you wouldn't really have any control over. I mean, you desat to a certain amount. There's only so much oxygen in the environment. You go up, and like the level of desaturation you can handle and I can handle are all different. Like, you see that in the ICUs and places like that. I mean, I obviously have no experience with this. I'm just talking from a physiologic standpoint. That just seems like a nuance that wouldn't really matter to me. If either you climbed Everest or you didn't climb it. I'm climbing Everest.
Did you climb it with oxygen or without?
It's like, Yeah. So, and I imagine that threshold he's talking about, that's probably, somewhere around the physiologic threshold where people crump, like people, people in, like you look at an ICU and kind of, they'll have a parameters and be like, hey, when somebody's desatting to this level, this is an emergency, everybody rush in there and let's stabilize.
Is there any way to train for that?
I'm sitting here thinking about it. I think the only thing that I could imagine would be how much vasculature you have, right? So like a lot of our vasculature atrophies as we get older, and that's one of the reasons like hyperbarics and a lot of the peptides and things, and one of the main ways exercise works, like when you exercise, you actually increase something called VEGF, which is an vascular endothelial growth factor, and you'll grow more blood vessels. The more you train, the more you perfuse your muscles, the more blood vessels you have. And the same thing with your brain. One of the things that happens with all the TBIs is we have brain inflammation, and that brain inflammation decreases the nutrients in that area, and you have vascular atrophy. And now that region of the brain doesn't work that well. And hyperbarics again, that actually it's one of the factors when we talked to Dan Engel, if you'll remember, about the psychedelics, they all increase BDNF, astrocyte-derived growth factors as well, and VEGF. And so that would be my guess, and probably primarily the brain. Like once your brain is getting a certain amount of oxygen, it's dropped to a certain amount of oxygen, it's just like shutting down to survive. And I don't see any way around it, because it wouldn't be hemoglobin saturation or how much hemoglobin you have. It would be like how much is actually getting to your brain. And that's going to be intracranial pressure. That's going to be vasculature. That's going to be, training to some degree, but there's just probably a lot of genetic luck in that.
Isn't there like a point where you have to be at Everest Base Camp for a certain amount of time to acclimate?
So this goes into the conversation of many people just don't understand what it takes to climb the mountain. It's not show up at Everest Base Camp and start the process. For those that don't understand, can you please walk us through what that process looks like? And are there varying approaches based off whoever's leading the trip?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to respect the physiology, right? And we essentially go through a process of acclimatization. So the area above 8,000 meters, this is notoriously known as the death zone. This is where your body can no longer acclimate. You're literally dying. Your body is catabolizing its own tissue in order to survive. And just to speak to that previous point for a second, with our experience, we just learn to watch people. And oftentimes what you see are people that begin to mask their symptoms, and they think that, people around them who have more experience are unaware. And that was one of my responsibilities on this trip that I took on, was just to really carefully watch Yusuf, because I know him at sea level, I know him at baseline. And then all of a sudden at 8,000 meters, he starts to act a little bit differently. And he was really a phenomenal athlete. I've never seen anybody spend 2 nights in the death zone, sleeping like a baby next to me in my tent, and then making it look fairly easy in comparison to most people with supplemental oxygen. Just to answer your question directly, I mean, essentially it's a 6 to 8 week expedition. There are various ways that people undertake their acclimatization schedules. So traditionally, everybody follows the rule of you climb high and you sleep low. And so you climb to Camp 1 or Camp 2, you descend, you'll spend 5-6 days recovering, you'll reascend the mountain, climb higher to Camp 3, descend to base camp. And so you're giving your body the opportunity to produce more red blood cells so that you can transport more oxygen. These days, you're seeing different strategies, because the base of Everest, essentially the area just above base camp, is called the Khumbu Icefall. This is the deadliest area on Everest. A lot of people lose their lives. 16 Sherpas were crushed by an avalanche tragically in 2016. So people want to minimize the amount of time that they're traversing this Khumbu Icefall. So what we saw this season is you saw a lot of people that essentially did one giant rotation. So they went to Camp 1, Camp 2, they descended to base camp, then they waited for the weather window. And what they do as strategies is they stock oxygen and they stack oxygen. And essentially everybody's breathing 3 or 4 liters per minute. You'll have 8 to 10 bottles of oxygen, and this renders everything more accessible, a little more safe. On the other end of the spectrum, people say It's not necessarily real climbing, if you will, but from a commercial standpoint, it's certainly an approach that is reducing the fatalities and making Everest much more accessible.
Are they using I'm assuming it's a face mask? Is it like a pilot would wear or something, or
Yes.
is it like a medical mask?
Throw
Yeah,
up Elia's Instagram. I think there's a few pics of you with the mask on.
Yeah, actually, my friend Ted, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, is an engineer, adventurer, and mountaineer himself. So he actually designed the top-out oxygen system. So it's a mask, that's obviously attached to the cylinder that you're carrying on your back. And for the most part, and it's wild to watch the local people who are the ones that are responsible for actually transporting the oxygen tanks, up into the death zone. And when you spend time at 8,000 meters at what they call the South Pole or Camp 4, there are, literally hundreds of bottles, of oxygen that is stashed there. And, it's not the climbers themselves that are carrying this oxygen. It's the brave and strong and noble local Sherpa people and other high altitude workers that are, doing the impossibly difficult work of transporting all that oxygen, getting it all into place so that there can be, safe summit attempts on the top of the world.
So what is that white canister in front? That's not your oxygen bottle, is it?
No, this is essentially, so this is the top out mask. So this is essentially, you're not breathing obviously pure oxygen through the mask. And Ted could obviously explain it better than I can, but you're getting a stream of pure oxygen mixed with the ambient air in the atmosphere. And so that excess reserve is essentially flowing into that small bag, palpating, so you can actually ensure that it's working. And that you're also not, wasting the supplemental oxygen that you're breathing.
So I've got to, Elia, you explained this to me on my trip over there. I mean, the Sherpas, it's almost like a rich white man sport, and the Sherpas do all the work. And I remember when we landed in Lukla, they're loading up all the bags, and these guys are having to deal with all the weight. And I'm like, oh man, I feel like a piece of, what right now. And you're like, hey, this is what they do. I understand. But I felt like I wasn't contributing to the overall effort. And the Sherpas, people think Sherpa is a job. It's not.
Correct.
It's a set of people that live within that region. So naturally, physiologically, they're probably just
there's natural selection for them just to live there in the first place, and then they're adapting to it every day.
Well, and they have a genetic component too, because they've lived there forever.
That's what I'm saying. Exactly. That's the natural selection.
Yeah.
The people who can handle that would die off, and the ones that procreate are the ones who can handle it. Yeah.
But in what I want people to understand is they do almost everything, and they are, of course, they set people up for success to ascend.
Yeah, I would say that, including myself, the majority of people, more than 99%, would not be able to summit Everest without the support of, and not just Sherpas. These days, initially it was all under the umbrella of Sherpas, if you will. Today it's more politically correct to use the term Nepalese climbers, which includes, Rais and Tamangs and other cast members, but the majority are the local Sherpa people of the mountain. And as you say, it's incredibly humbling because you do all the work here at sea level, right? And you're trained and you're mentally strong and you're prepared. And then you show up there and all of that preparation seems like it's for nothing because you're weak, you're beaten down, and you just don't have access to the power because you don't have the acclimatization in place. So particularly in the beginning of an expedition, it's incredibly humbling. And then through and throughout, I mean, you're doing your thing, you showed up responsibly, and then these guys just kind of zip by with 30 kilograms on their backs with a burlap strap strapped to their head, and they got a smile on their face, and they're making it look easy. So yeah, the vast amount
weigh like 135
so they're
pounds.
Like they're
small guys.
Yeah, when I was in Peru for when Karen Kelly ran that Inca Trail Marathon, and that's toughest marathon in the world. They had Sherpas that were setting up tents and stuff for them to sleep in the night before, and these guys, I mean, they were so small. They were 130 pounds, just little dudes, and the packs on them were 3 times their size, and they're just walking along like nothing. And you have all these people who've been training to run this thing, feeling great. I'm like, I would feel like an idiot, because these dudes went ahead of them, set everything up, then did the trail, set everything up again, then did the trail, then brought
so they did like
back
27
down.
different marathons.
So they did like 5 times with the people who went there to run.
They're hard. These people are hard by
Yeah.
necessity. And I remember when we're on the trail from Lukla to Namche, you're watching like young kids being bathed in what has to be high 40s, 50-degree water, and they're not screaming where our children would just
Yeah.
be like screaming
Yeah.
bloody murder.
Well,
By necessity, they're hard. And I have no doubt you go back to the wild, wild west, people had to be hard back then. It's just we've become so comfortable, creature comforts,
Right.
that we've lost that hardness.
well, and,
Yeah, think
my,
about the people who settled America, or came across in wagons, and just
Yeah.
like where we live, just think about just coming across here in a wagon.
Well, I
and
mean, just the fact that like,
going 2 miles an hour
like
for
the story
months.
of the Comanches.
Yeah,
It's like unbelievable.
yeah. We're soft weaklings.
So when I think I told you guys the story when I was playing the NFL, Dr. Incledon sent me a hypoxic chamber. And so I basically set it up around my bed because I had ended up gassing out at the playing against the Broncos. And he's like, I got this hypoxic chamber. So he sends it to me and I built it around my bed, and then I pumped in, and it basically reduced the oxygen down to Everest base camp, but I had to acclimatize into it.
Mhm.
And when people would come over, I would be like, hey, just let me set it up and just go in there for like 30 minutes. And people would have an absolute freak out. And I used to sleep
Headaches.
in it. Yeah.
Headaches.
Oh yeah. They'd feel sick. They didn't want to be in it. And we thought it was hysterical. And I'd just go in there and hang out. And it ended up being, then when I went to go back to play the Broncos, I was like, felt fine. But yeah, I slept at Everest Base Camp for like a year. It was weird. So if you ever invited girls over, it was kind of strange too, because I'd like to zip them in there and be like, set it up.
What weird stuff are you into?
This chick's like, oh, this weird tent and this oxygen thing. I'm like,
This has a Bill Cosby feel to it. We should probably
Yeah.
move on.
I was like, you guys can voluntarily stay, or you can sleep on the couch, whatever you need.
well, and
Oh, yeah.
just on that, just quickly, there are actually rapid acclimatization programs that are offered by some companies now. Where you do your pre-acclimatization long before you show up, and I think on Choyu, one of the records, I don't know if it was a week or two, gate to gate. I think it might have been a week, where they pre-acclimatized in the hypoxic tent, showed up in Tibet, scaled Choyu, which is a couple hundred meters lower than Everest, and then got out of Dodge pretty quick. And the argument for this is, not only your time away, but it's less exposure in a lot of these danger zones on the mountain. And we saw that this year. We were there for 65 days, and living at altitude, and Mike, you got a good taste of it. It's difficult. It takes a beating on your body, it takes a beating on your mind. And this year there was a brutal virus that was circulating around base camp. I was actually a victim of that. I was sick for 3-4 weeks, didn't know what the hell was going on, but just that lengthy exposure. And then the exposure on the mountain, it just raises the stakes, if you will. So people are finding clever ways to minimize that, and it seems to be working.
So I saw this with the people in South America, like the people that lived at altitude, the people that have like grown up and lived it genetically, like it actually acts as anti-aging. They don't age as fast. But then when you take people that are at the base and you put them up there, it ages you in dog years.
Yeah.
So I wonder the genetic components.
Well, Elliot, it seems like Mount Everest is taking a lot of scrutiny this year. In particular, I know 12 deaths, 5 missing. What in your opinion, what's going on?
Yeah, what's going on? We saw something similar happen, and I have unfortunately been at the wrong place at the right time, or the right place at the wrong time, depending how you look at it, and have been in the middle of these disasters over and over. And I was there in 14 when 16 Sherpas died, then 15 during the earthquake when 18 died, and then in 2019 when 11 people died. And that was the year of the quote unquote traffic jam that made international headlines around the world. And it was an oversimplified explanation of a very nuanced and complex situation on the mountain. And I started investigating this, and I just thought, you know what, some of this doesn't add up. And somebody who understands the environment, that then reads the headlines and the nuances that are reported, you just start asking questions. You go, well, this doesn't make sense. And so what I started to see is that this became a case of inexperience combined with poor leadership, combined in some instances, not all, with negligence that needs investigation. And all of this stacked together. And then in 11, what we saw was sort of the perfect storm, where the traffic actually, what it did was it exposed the weaknesses, it exposed the problems, the real problems. And so this year, I haven't done that. I haven't investigated every single death, but same problems. Too many people on the mountain, too many people that are so permits, that are not physically prepared, mentally prepared, that lack the experience, combined with this new issue that started developing, where you have low budget operators that are essentially coming in, and what they're doing is they're providing logistical services. And this idea of providing logistical services seems to have become this sort of get out of jail free card, where people wipe their hands free of it and say, well, we just sold that person a cheap trip. We were not necessarily responsible for them. They were responsible for themselves. And if you look at that business model and flip that over to the West here, it would never fly. There would be lawsuits and there would be charges and investigations. And it just seems to be the Wild East out on Everest. The other thing is that it's absolutely worth stating that there are a lot of really good actors out there. There are a lot of responsible local companies and foreign companies, and it's as though the standards of safety are just much higher with those that have the experience. And you're getting foreigners that are looking to save some money, a couple, $1,000, tens of thousands of dollars, and the next thing they're in a situation where their life is on the line. And then the ripple effect of that is that the local people's lives are on the line because they need to save them. And then you hear these stories where, those local people have to abandon their clients in order to save themselves, right? In the death zone, you got to remember, like, you're on the edge of space almost. There's almost nothing that you can do. And so when we see these superhuman efforts by Sherpas that are literally carrying people on their backs, it's unbelievable to think about the reality of being able to do that. We can barely tie our crampons onto our boots. That's how exhausting it is. So when you see a Sherpa like that, but what you don't see are the guys that end up with frostbite, who end up losing, fingers or toes because of reckless behavior on the mountain because some people tried to save some money.
Is there a substantial increase in the number of permits? So is it, percentage wise, is it equally as safe and you're just putting more people through there, or do you think it's too many people coming through and lowering safety standards, and it's a much higher percentage of people who are having injury, severe casualty or death?
Yes, it's a good question. This year I believe the number was 468 permits that were sold, and you have to remember that I think the stats are something like 1.6 local people, so Sherpas or other indigenous tribes that are working on the mountain, support every person that has a permit. So this year you had over 1,200 people that were heading to the summit, and 2011 or 2019 was a perfect storm because you had a very narrow weather window, right? So you only had a couple of days where you could attempt the summit, so everybody charged and went for the summit at the same time. This year, and Mike, to the statement about climate change, or the excuse, of climate change, it absolutely was a very cold year on Everest. The weather was unstable, unpredictable, overcast, snowing a lot, very cold. But everybody rushed during that first window because they were afraid that there wasn't going to be a second one. But those of us that had, weather forecasts that we trusted and had the patience and the experience to wait, we didn't get into issues as a result of that. So are there a lot of people? Absolutely, there are a lot of people. Arguably, are there too many people? Yeah. Is that going to change in the near future? I doubt it. There's a lot of money involved. The Nepal government makes a lot of money because of these permits.
So you said
that's not something that's going to happen.
You said, I think, 468. Like, how do you know how many were sold 10 years ago or 20 years ago? Is that
that's
kind of been the same for a while?
There's some data on it's called the Himalayan database. So they've got all the stats, but that's 468 permits sold this year. In 2019, I believe there was 70 or so less. So more and more people are buying permits, wanting to climb Everest, and so much of that correlates to the rise of Web 2 and social media. And sort of the reward system, that comes along with, flashing your photos on top of the world, the glory photos, and then bypassing and failing to mention how you got there, and really everything else, that's going on the mountain at the same time. And that's where we're running into problems.
What's the cost Like, is there a monetary? Does it cost like a 100,000, $1 million? I mean, I don't know what is the financial obligation.
Top end, low end.
Yeah, top end, low end. I mean, it's $11,000, you know, for the permit, right? So average price, you know, these days you're looking at, you know, $65,000, $75,000 for the competent operators. This year, you know, a local friend of mine sent me this photograph in this massive white dome with, you know, a king size bed for one person that paid, you know, well over $100,000, you know, for that amount of comfort. The low end operators, it can range anywhere from, you know, $20,000 to $35,000. And you get what you pay for. And when you cut corners on Everest, unfortunately, it has a ripple effect and it puts people's lives at risk. And I always say, you know, the
can't wrap my
climbers
head
are
around.
responsible.
Like, I want to climb Everest, but I want to do it in the most comfort like way.
How does a Sherpa even get a king size bed up? I mean,
Like,
no,
these guys are absolute like
Helicopters.
They're like warrior ants. They just like carry stuff. But like, think about it. Like I would imagine that you're like investing in this idea of climbing Everest. There's something of the purity of like, I have to suffer a little bit. Like, I want to climb Everest because I want to get my selfie, but I don't want to suffer to get there. Like,
it robs the experience.
Yeah, you should just push those people off the top of the backside of that thing.
Yet alone, like, to be just surrounded by hundreds of people in base camp, it just wouldn't seem like, if I go into nature.
Did you know they have prostitutes at base camp? I was doing some research, and they were running a prostitution ring at base camp.
Come on.
Elia?
I haven't heard that one.
Okay. But you just started a good rumor. We should write an article.
Well, that there's a brothel at base camp?
Yes.
That's what they said on the internet, and everybody believes everything on the internet.
It's true.
Yeah, everything on the internet is true. It's on.
But they say a lot. I mean,
well, I was actually hoping to ask him because he would know, but I'm like, what is this brothel like? I mean, so and then how do you acclimatize these girls up there?
Well, they're Sherpas. They grew up in them. So the Hungarian that passed away, you actually were in close proximity to him.
We were. Yeah, we were. Our summit day was complicated, and there was a climber from Hungary, and of course at the time, you know, everybody's dressed in down suits, colorful down suits, red, green, yellow. He happened to have been dressed in red and yellow, and our climber Yusuf, he passed him, who was also climbing without supplemental oxygen, and this gentleman was very slow, and I tried to talk to him just to check in with him to ask him if he was okay. He was unresponsive, and I assume that, you know, most people who are attempting to climb without O2, they're just cut from a different cloth. You know, there's a mentality that they have that an extreme athlete can relate to. So I understood the commitment, and I just assumed, you know, maybe he's Russian, maybe he doesn't speak English. So we kept climbing, and he didn't look like he was, you know, in distress at all, just that he was tired. And then essentially I explained what happened with our climber who made it to what they call the south summit of Everest. And so on descent, we crossed paths with this climber once again. And it was quite late in the day at that point. You know, it was past 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And historically, you know, your turnaround times on Everest are 11 a.m. at the latest, but we happened to have perfect weather that day. So as we were descending, I just kept looking back, and I was 1,000 feet below, watching this, you know, tiny figure in the distance just relentlessly make his way to the top. And, you know, the sun was setting, and it's, you know, it's very dangerous, you know, to be attempting the summit at that hour. And I just didn't know, you know, what was going to happen. When we last crossed him, you know, he was in good shape, he was still moving, and then, you know, a couple hours later, still up on the ridge. And then unfortunately, it was reported that he was seen the next morning, incapacitated, not in good shape, with frostbite, and apparently with cerebral edema near the Hillary Step. And when a rescue team was deployed, which ironically happened to be the same Sherpa, Gelji, who was carrying the climber on his back, they didn't find him, tragically.
Did you guys see that video?
He died.
He's got the guy in the sleeping bag.
It's strapped into his back and was.
So you got to when you're paying $50,000.
So are the Sherpas are the Sherpas wearing oxygen?
The Sherpas are using supplemental oxygen. Traditionally, they're using much less than foreigners, and it's something that I always try to make sure that my guys on my team, because it's, you know, everything that I do because of the support that I have from local people. So I try to make sure that they have as much oxygen as they want. There is some pride involved, so they don't always want, you know, maximum flow. In my case with PK, he had ample oxygen with him. So they are, but they're not breathing anywhere near the flow rates that foreigners are. And they always have less bottles of oxygen than foreigners do traditionally.
Wow. I understand if somebody pays, let's say $60,000, you're close to the summit, but a guide makes a decision of, hey, no, we just got a weather report. This isn't looking good. We're going down. I mean, that's a difficult situation to deal with with a client who's come all that way and paid all that money. That's difficult.
Well, I mean, yeah. Is it weird that I have zero desire to do this?
He's not paying to get to the summit. He's paying for the experience of
he wants to see the brothel.
Yeah. Okay.
I watched in prep for this, I watched a bunch of stuff, and I think it's amazing to see, and the scenery looks great, and I'm like, I'm just totally happy to see this. There was not a single inkling in me that was like, man,
it's about as attractive as an ultra marathon to me.
Okay, let's put it in perspective. I think for me, it's more the time. 8 to 6 weeks is a lot of time. And I hate to, it was a wonderful experience to see it jumping out of the helicopter.
Yeah.
But we didn't have to acclimatize.
Yeah.
It was a quick process. We got to see it and we saw it from a unique perspective. Yeah. I understand why people get into the sport. I can understand why it's addictive, but it just takes so much time.
Yeah. It'd be like, hey, I want to do this ultra marathon, but I'm going to do it on roller skates. It's like, well, then just, I don't know. It just feels like there has to be some effort, like the danger, the suffering. I don't know if I'm going to go sleep here in my king size bed. I'm like, dude, that sounds, I don't know.
Elia, I think it's, if I could just say something about that, I think it's important to remember as well that everything that we're discussing here, I mean, this is the commercialized side of quote unquote climbing or mountaineering, right? And by, alpinism standards, the classic routes that we're talking about here, this is the one that was pioneered in 1953 by Sorbonne Hillary Tenzing Norgay. Within the alpinism community, it's not a respected goal anymore. However, it's incredibly important to note that if you look at somebody like Kilian Jornet, for example, who is climbing solo up the West Ridge of Everest, where less than a handful of people have summited, to be completely on his own in the purest style possible without supplemental oxygen, that's alpinism, and that's why, they label, high altitude mountaineering, high altitude tourism these days. So there's this vast difference between the commercial climber and the actual alpinist.
If you're doing it for chicks, though, they don't know. Well, you just say, hey, I climbed Everest.
Yeah, but has anyone ever really gotten attractive women for that?
I don't know.
I mean, should we go out and be like, hey,
I don't know if you.
I mean, that's like somebody saying,
you're not doing it for chicks.
Well, I played in the NFL and girls were like, "Cool story, bro."
Yeah, whatever.
This guy's a SEAL. This guy's a SEAL. I'm going home with him.
Yeah, it's a true story. But I mean, then you have to tell war stories. Like, so there I was,
surrounded by
I killed Bin Laden.
Elia, can you talk? And this is a crazy story. Can you talk about K2 and the whole ordeal with the recovery, or are you still keeping that close wraps?
Yeah, no, I mean, we can, if you have questions about that, I'd love to share.
I think the audience would love to hear this story because this is insane. Sure. He basically was helping out Pakistan, but then got run out of the country, but trying to recover two of his brothers from the mountain who were deceased and still up there, correct?
Yes, correct. Yeah, it's that's a very condensed version. It's a great log line, but I mean, in brief, I mean, 2021, I mean, there are 14 8,000 meter peaks in the world, and they had all been conquered up until 2021. And to do them in winter is just a whole other challenge, right? Minus 50 degrees, minus 80 degree, temperatures up there. And essentially 2021 was a race to the top. And so you had quite a number of sort of commercial clients that were, trying to conquer the peak. You had an amazing team of Nepalese Sherpas, that were also attempting the summit, led by Nirmal Persia. And then you had this small team of underdogs, John Snorri, Ali Sapara, and Sajid Sapara. And my job is, I'm a storyteller. I'm in the filmmaking industry. I'm also an adventurer and do a bunch of other things, but that's my core line of work. And I'm always looking for these stories. And to me, I felt like there's like absolutely no way K2 in winter is not going to be summited by the Nepalese team this year. Like that was hands down going to be the outcome. And it was. And they made history, and they made it look quite easy. It was absolutely amazing what they achieved. But I wanted to support the underdogs. And Ali Sapara, the nation's sort of unsung hero at the time, if you will, and his son, essentially, long story short, I supported their expedition. I inserted myself, if you will, with Pasang Kaji Sherpa, and then we were, trying to keep up with them. It was a ridiculous effort trying to keep up with guys that had been on the mountain for 6 weeks. And long story short, tragically, they disappeared near the summit. And Sajid Sapara, Ali Sapara's son, survived, and John Snorri, Ali Sapara, and Juan Pablo Mora, a Chilean climber, never returned. And the reason that we survived, PK and I, and Fazal Ali, was because we had the humility to turn back, and we couldn't source our supplemental oxygen. And we assessed the situation, and we just said, look, man, this sucks. This is going to appear as a defeat, but it's just not worth risking our lives. And so we turned back. They were never found. And I was part of this 14-day, search and rescue operation where, the military asked me to, embark on one of their helicopters and to photograph what we thought could be our friends. And 14 days later, they were never found. And obviously an impossible situation, and the nation was mourning. And it was this complex moment because here you had the Nepalese team that made history, and it was supposed to be this historic accomplishment, and it was, but it was just marred with sadness and loss and death. And so just a real impossible situation that I was at the center of.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. The bodies have been located. They were seen on the mountain. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, so in winter, they were never found, and I had to zip off to Everest for a film that I was shooting on the local Sherpa people. And the whole time I was obsessing about K2, thinking about our friends, thinking about young Sajid who survived, and I wanted to do something. And I was paying attention to what Sajid's plans were going to be, and he just wasn't getting the support that he needed to go and mount a search operation to find his dad. And so with like 3 weeks notice, I was just looking at all this going, like, I can't sit here and do nothing. I can't not help this kid and help facilitate, an expedition where we can be a part of this. We can help him go and try to locate his fallen father. And ultimately, through the expedition, together with the help of some friends behind the scenes, my mate PK Sherpa led the expedition. We had a couple of local Pakistani climbers, and against all odds, Ali, John, and Juan Pablo Mora were found. And ultimately, we were able to bury Ali Sapara at 7,900 meters above sea level on the world's second tallest mountain. And it was just an unbelievably emotional experience. And watching young Sajid go through that was heartbreaking, impossible, and yet at the same time, we felt really good that we took the risk. And that we supported him, and that he was able to do what he ended up doing for his dad. And to answer your question, yes, John, unfortunately, is still up there. There was nothing we could do. We were under supported, a small team of underdogs, so we had to leave John. But we managed to bury Ali at 8,000 meters.
Wow, it's almost like the death zone is equivalent to the open ocean. Once you're gone, you're staying up there for the most part.
Yeah, well, it's like the commitment of no supplemental oxygen. Once you're in, you're in. There's no turning back. And unfortunately, there's this intoxicating allure, of reaching that summit, and people become obsessed. And we see it a lot. We see people who become very irrational, and it's all about their summit glory. And unfortunately, good men died on that expedition, and there are children that are left without their fathers, and widows, and that for me is a tremendous loss as well, because that vicarious trauma gets passed on to them. So it's complicated, and that's why you got to approach these mountains with respect. You have to be humble. You got to bow down with reverence. Because nature is going to control the outcome, and the mountain doesn't care who you are, where you're from, how much money you have. It's really about showing up, with humility, prepared, and in the most responsible way possible.
Don't confuse your enthusiasm with your capability. And we see that so often, where, that was a mantra within our profession is brand new SEALs we call it, you know, the Dunning-Kruger effect, the peak of Mount Stupid. Oh, we can do this. It's like, no, you actually, you don't have the experience. You're not equipped, and you got to talk them off a ledge. Elia, you've got some documentaries in the works. Where can people find you? And what's the future hold for you, man?
Yeah, so thanks for asking that. So there are 2 films that are in the works, documentary features. There's one on K2. There's one on the season on Everest in 2019 that we spoke about as well. You can find me at Elia Saikaly on Instagram, Facebook, all the channels. And as far as the what's next, I'm just off the mountain, so trying to recover, take care of myself. You know, self-care. That's a high priority, and then also working on a book, which is exciting. So that's in the pipeline, and from there we'll see.
Right on.
That's amazing.
So, guys, we have a few questions, and Elia, please stick around. So we'll start.
Sure.
I've got the first one, and Will's going to pull up more. I actually love this one. What advice do you give young men growing up in such an anti-masculine world? And we talked about this earlier. I mean, we all, before the podcast started, is that what we found is in the.
Do we have to live in that world?
No, you
I
don't.
live
But
in that world.
young men, I wouldn't even say young men. I'd say men across the spectrum are yearning for coaching and mentorship from what, and I hate to use the word traditional masculine men, just men. I mean, because we are inundated, again, social media, people without credibility who've got a microphone saying the same exact thing about discipline. I've heard more about discipline, I think, in the last 2 years than I did in my entire 20 years in the military. It's like, we get it. But that's a great question for, let's say, young men in schools who are not surrounded by strong, it's not male, just strong leaders. What let's start with Elia. Elia, what would you advise young men struggling to find coaches and mentors?
Yeah, I mean, just to personalize for a second, I was very fortunate to have incredible men around me when I was 16, 17 years old, you know, coaches that I could trust, and, you know, men that were good role models. So I think a lot of it starts there. I think there's so much BS and noise and nonsense out there. And I think it's just crucial to just understand how to just get rid of that noise. And to understand that, I mean, you can be, you know, brave and strong and powerful and determined, and you can be all these things, but you can also be soft and real and vulnerable and transparent and be in touch with your emotions, and that is strength as well. And I think as a starting point, I mean, those would be the guidelines where I would begin.
Yeah, for me, I think masculine energy is really just all about self-determination, right? So we're kind of, the masculine is directed towards procurement, protection, provisioning. So it's like going out, making something of yourself, making the world a better place, raising a family, protecting your family, providing for people, providing, mentoring young people, whatever it is. And just having the courage to keep doing that regardless of what the noise is. I mean, I think that's because the noise is so irrational you can't even quantify it anymore, right? Because they just scream something different every day, and all it basically means is we don't want competitive men out there trying to do great things because it makes us feel bad about ourselves, and that's kind of what it's about. So for me, it's you know, set goals, work towards your goals, find good people to help you along the path of those goals, and just be real and honest, and have the courage to do what you know you need to do, because we all know what it is. Like, it's not that complex. and I think that gets rid of everybody else's opinion, because, like, well, you can say whatever you want, but I'm heading that way, and you can throw things this way and that way and shout and whatever, but that's where I'm going, and I have a reason for doing that, and I got a good group of people around me. And to me, that's kind of the essence of masculinity.
Amen.
As you guys know, I'm kind of a nerd, but as a rhetoric major, one of the quotes, I actually have it in my bathroom and I have it in my son's room, which is from Seneca, which is, a gem cannot be polished without friction, nor a man perfected without trials. So I think being able to set up these trials, and then even to quote one of my favorite movies, Almost Famous, where she says, be bold and mighty forces will come to your aid. Like, have big dreams and do things. And what I've found, especially for myself and also the athletes I've worked with, if they have lofty goals, people are willing to support you if you're crazy enough to try to attempt something.
But
And
I think that I think that can get in the way, because for some people grew up made a lot of bad choices, grew up in a shit environment. They just entered Alcoholics Anonymous, and like staying sober one more day is like a plenty goal for them. And then once they do that for 30 days, like getting a job serving coffee and like showing up to work every day, and then like joining a gym or starting jiu-jitsu or something, like you don't have to be aiming to be the top of the world. It's just like, you've got to be working towards something is valuable.
Yeah, but isn't everybody's perception a little bit different? Like,
I'm challenging
like,
the word lofty goals.
Well, but I
agree with you.
Think about like at some point somebody stood at the bottom of Everest, looked up to it, and thought, I'm going to climb that.
Right.
Like, that's not my goal. And if I stood there, I'd be like, wow, that looks pretty bitchin'. I'd, send me a picture. But like, there's other goals I want to attain. And I think, the lack of hardship, and Mike was talking a little bit about it, doesn't do anything to shape people. You think about the Grand Canyon was cut by water over time and friction, and it wasn't, so I don't know if as a man or even as a person, if you can develop without some form of friction, without trials, without, successes and failures and reevaluating and doing this, like the fact that what even bothers me more is the fact that there's people that had a Sherpa carry a king size bed up Everest because they just wanted to do it. And I know why he said that. Like, no longer is this considered a task, because now you can buy your way to the top.
We would all call that guy a bitch.
Yeah, and like when he came down, he showed me his bed. I'd punch him.
Yeah, you needed a king size bed. You're a bitch.
No, like sleep on the ground.
Above John's head is what they call the Man in the Arena speech by Teddy Roosevelt, which actually came from this Citizen in the Republic speech. But
we also have it in my podcast room.
Do you?
Everybody should have this.
And there's a point where I'm going with this. One, you're absolutely right. You are defined by hardship. You are defined by one, we all know you do not grow unless you push yourself outside your physical and mental comfort zones. That's where true learning and growth takes place. That's where the scars are developed that ultimately character is forged from. But I was going to go back to say, to this quote is like, well, first off, stop listening to media, whether left or right. Don't apologize for being a man. And one person I like, and I know he's mainstream, is Jordan Peterson, who talks about this. Be dangerous. But what makes being dangerous even more masculine is knowing when and when not to use it. Just because you can crush somebody doesn't mean you should. We are in a weird time. And the way I put it is everyone wants to attack men, especially, let's be honest, from the left. When I think they're looking at the wrong males. There's a lot of guys that talk tough. And we even saw this in the SEALs. The guys who were the biggest guy who talked tough, but when the rounds started to fly, they wouldn't leave the security of the cover they were behind. And it was the quiet guy who would get up and charge ahead. So, we want you to be strong. And is to Elia's point, but what I've come to learn is vulnerability or emotional intimacy amongst any group, and being vulnerable is where trust is formed. For young men who don't have access to traditional coaches, or maybe they're just in a bad situation, I would say read. Yeah. It is mentorship through readership. Read about Teddy Roosevelt. Go pick up a book. Try to emulate the breadcrumbs that they leave, because that was one of the biggest adventurers and explorers in American history. Yeah. So go out, and I think of Dwayne Fields, which is an amazing story, who grew up in the I forget what he calls it. It's basically like the burbs of London, dirt poor, Black Britain, and he was the first guy to walk the North Pole. He said, I needed something different. I needed to do something that no one had ever done, something that was so hard that was going to test me. Get outside your urban environment or whatever environment, go into the wilderness, start to learn from there. Because the wilderness, and to your point, Elia, nature always wins. Nature is going to be the best forger of men.
Yeah. The great equalizer.
I mean, Teddy Roosevelt, amazing. Like the Rough Riders and all that, like incredible dude.
And I think, the confusion and the modern parlance and the media, the completely non-nuanced, as he was speaking about earlier, headline kind of media. They're equating masculinity, all of what they're calling toxic masculinity. It's really psychopathy, right? I mean, you can be strong and dangerous and a badass man and be a psychopath. Unfortunately, the only person who can stop that is another strong, badass man who's not a psychopath. And so you have to have masculinity, or the psychopaths will just rule the world. They just run the world, and whether that's through lawfare or warfare or whatever, the psychopaths will just dominate everybody if regular men aren't strong enough to stop them.
This is where I think people get it wrong. What was the Hollywood actor who used his position, not only or his strength as male, and his role as he went to the whole Me Too movement was based off this guy.
No, he was the producer.
Producer
Harvey Weinstein.
Harvey Weinstein.
Right.
That guy's not a man. That is not a man.
No, that wasn't masculinity.
That's not masculinity. That's predatory.
Psychopathy.
Well,
yeah,
he's a predator.
Yeah, he's a predator.
And that's not our definition of man. And I think that's what's wrong too. You're looking at the wrong.
But the only reason
figures.
He's in prison is because there are strong men
That
put him there.
Yeah, and women that stepped up
Right.
and had the courage, even though media beat them down, which was sad to see. We do have one more.
Well,
Go ahead.
it was because like Oprah and Whoopi Goldberg and all the women on The View who were on Epstein's plane too. They were the ones like, oh, he's an amazing person. So I don't know, man. It's very two-faced, kind of scummy.
We do have a question for Elia, and we'll finish here. What's the biggest lesson you've learned from all of this, all your time on the mountain, and what would you have told your younger self?
I mean, my greatest lessons have come through my failures, and the greatest takeaway for me has just been reinforced humility, throughout all of this. And, as I said earlier, I mean, the mountain is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, what you've done. So it's the humility that I've taken away. And I think that humility really has kept me alive. I've lost a lot of friends up there. I've seen a lot of very competent climbers, unfortunately, make some bad decisions and not return. Accidents happen. And so that for me, and that extends everywhere in my life. And ultimately that ripples into, kindness and empathy and caring about other human beings. And, every time I'm up on that mountain, I'm much more concerned with what's going on around me than I am of my own, physical pursuit or desire to, get to the top. So that's been a huge takeaway. And the local people of Nepal have just reinforced that because they embody that. So that's really changed my life. And what would I say to my younger self? Don't take it all so seriously, man. Just, be focused, be determined, and do what you're doing, but, laugh at yourself along the way as well. Because it's just, we're here for one ride, and how, fortunate are we to even exist and to be alive. And so, yeah, there was a part of me in my earlier years where I was just fiercely determined, a lot of sacrifice, obviously, to get to where I am as all of the, men in this room. But yeah, just have a bit more fun and don't take it all so seriously.
That's what we call wisdom. Yeah. With age, the one thing we didn't talk about, which we the Everyday Warrior, our crew is going to have to go over to Nepal. At least just go into Namche is the coolest experience, even if you don't go beyond. But we watched in Kathmandu an open air cremation. Have you ever? It's the Hindu culture.
Yeah, where they burn bodies
right there in the public,
yeah.
And they start with the face based off of their beliefs. It was just very interesting to watch. Very fortunate that they allow people to come and be part of the ceremony, and very respectful, very humbling. But that's a conversation for a different time. Elia, I can't thank you enough for joining us. Any closing words, guys? Takeaways? Except brothels and
no. I mean, I'm super fascinated on K2.
Find out about the brothels.
Like the K2 thing is wild because
John's
K2 is not as high, but much more treacherous. Right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. How many people climb K2 compared to Everest?
Well, they call the how many people? I mean, you're talking about hundreds versus thousands. Yeah, and they call the Savage Mountain the mountain that's trying to kill you. And that's what it can feel like. And they say, K2 is, I mean, it's like versus Everest. Everest is Disneyland in comparison. It's the real deal. It's a savage mountain. It's incredibly steep. There are rocks flying at you like bullets the entire way. So it's incredibly dangerous. And so, the attempted, feat in 2021, it was a really big deal, that made headlines around the world. And I hope
Isn't
that
the height difference completely insignificant?
It's the technical nature of it.
I mean, like how much height difference are we talking about? Like
150 meters.
150. Come on.
So
200 meters.
we had
Yeah,
Colin O'Brady on the podcast, and he told us the story of they were trying to ascend, and then they decided not to, and then the Nepalese went up and did it, and how he was like, they should have done it. So it was kind of neat that I've heard that story.
Yeah.
Also
Well, I got to know Colin on that expedition actually. So that's where we met. So everybody was all on that same team that was heading towards the top. It was a tough year. A lot of good men were lost that year, unfortunately.
Yeah. And then I think he said there was guys that turned around and they never found him. I mean, he was pretty. Yeah.
Hats off to anyone that puts their hat into that arena. Well, guys, I can't thank you enough for joining us. For all the listeners and viewers, we'll be around next Friday. And, I'm excited for the future. We've got some changes coming to the Everyday Warrior. Let me just say that all boats rise with the tide, and good things to come. All right, guys, we'll see you next Friday.
Thanks, gentlemen.